think we should be good.
Good morning, everyone. Please feel free to get your donuts and coffee. And welcome here. And if you're visiting us, I'm Pastor Sean, and we have a special guest today doing our presentation in here for the Sunday School Hour, and then also doing our Sunday service message. So I'm really excited about this. We've had a relationship with Creation Ministries International for about 15 years, and I have just always really valued their ministry to us as we increasingly get pushback at the gentlest to, yes, Garth?
No, sorry, I'm just waving down some of my Sunday school kids. Sorry.
Okay.
Question?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So anyways, we're really happy to have him here. I think today will hopefully arm you with a lot of answers for questions that we're going to get, especially if you have kids in school, things like that. So I'm really excited about this day. I'm just going to pray, and then I'll ask Thomas to come forward. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and I pray that you would anoint Thomas all morning, that you would give him the words to speak, that he would really give clarity to us. And Father, we just ask that you would give him endurance as he speaks through this morning. And Lord, just may we do everything today to glorify you, and may your name be praised in all of this. So we thank you for him, and we thank you for this day. In Jesus' name, amen. Thomas Bailey, Creation Ministries International.
Good morning. All right. Yes, I'm from Creation Ministries International. We are an apologetics ministry. No, we're not apologizing for anything. Comes from a Greek word that means to give a defense or make an answer when people challenge us about our faith. And I'll give a more complete introduction to myself and the ministry in the next session, but basically we do employ quite a few PhD scientists who do research that shows how scientific evidence backs up what the Bible tells us about six-day creation, what we would call a young earth, and yes, there was a global flood. We'll talk more about those things in the next session. But in this one, we're going to look at biology. So get ready. There's a lot of information coming your way in a short period of time. And I think probably all of us know that children ask pretty good questions, don't they? What do you think? You ask them really good, challenging questions, right? Sometimes they're ones that we're not prepared for. I recall myself when I was in school, I don't know, maybe age 10, they taught me that it takes 9 months to have a baby. And I'm the youngest of 7 children. And I happen to know that there's a lot of family history that went on long before I was born. But I knew that I had 2 siblings who were born about 8 months apart in the same year. And I was pretty good at math. So I went home and asked my mother if one of them was born premature. Because they taught me that word that day. That's when I found out that my brother was adopted. I don't know when they were planning to tell me that, but I sort of forced the issue by that challenging question. Now, some of the classic ones we hear, of course, are things like, why is the sky blue? I was in grade 11 when I learned the scientific answer to that. Or how about the one that we all look forward to, where do babies come from? Don't worry, parents, I'm not going to address that today. That's your job. But an even bigger question than that pretty much everybody asks at some point in time is, where did everything come from? We look around us at the created universe. We look in the cosmos. We look at our world. We see all of these different living things, and we ultimately ask, where did all of this come from? And it boils down primarily to one of a couple of possibilities. Now, did it all arise naturally over the course of time, just by random chance accidents? Or was everything, in fact, created or designed? Now, there are some that would suggest that, God maybe used some system of evolution to create. We'll address that briefly in a few minutes and again in the next session. But it kind of boils down primarily to these. Did everything arise naturally on its own, or was it created? Now, being a Christian, of course, I look to see what the Bible has to tell me. And if I go to Genesis 1, verse 11, it says this, "And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind." Now, further down in verse 21, it says, "So God created the great sea creatures, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind." Further down it says, "God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind." Are you sensing a theme here? God's telling us He's creating all of these different living things according to their kinds. Further down it says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over all the other created things." Now, he doesn't use the same phrase here, according to their kinds, but obviously man is being created here special, to be in a special relationship with God. We're created distinct from all the other living creatures. But what we get all the way through Genesis 1 here is that each of these different types of living things is created according to its kind, to reproduce according to its kind. So dogs make dogs. Apple trees make apple trees. Cows make cows. We observe that sort of thing. What we don't see is one type of creature creating some other completely different kind of creature. Now, you may have heard of the famous atheist Richard Dawkins. He said this in one of his books. He said, "We have seen that living things are too improbable and too beautifully designed to have come into existence by chance." Now, please understand, Richard Dawkins does not believe in a creator or an intelligent designer, right? He believes that everything that in fact evolved by chance over long periods of time. But in this book, he's admitting everything really looks like it's been designed. Well, if it looks like it's been designed, then there's a good chance it was. No, Richard Dawkins believes in the theory of evolution. And there's a couple of different definitions for evolution that you might hear, and sometimes they get mixed up. One of them, we'll borrow this from Gerald Kirkut. He said that evolution is the theory that all the living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form. That's a pretty good overall definition of the idea of naturalistic evolution. You start with a single-celled common ancestor that sort of popped into existence on its own from non-living chemicals. Nobody knows how that's possible. And then from that, everything else evolved and developed over deep time. Well, this idea has been largely put forward by a guy named Charles Darwin. Anybody ever hear him? Yeah. Well, he wrote a book a number of years ago called On the Origin of a Species. That's the short title. Now, he wasn't the first person to ever talk about the concept of evolution, but he popularized the idea back in the 1800s. And he talked about a concept called the evolutionary tree of life. He envisioned this notion that if you start with a single cell common ancestor, then over time it gradually develops over different generations into different types of creatures. And different plants and fish and birds and everything branch off from this common ancestor over time. So it looks like a tree. Now, this is an idea that I think we can agree has had some effect on our world and the way people think, even on people's faith. A fellow by the name of Frank Zindler, an atheist, said this. He said, "The most devastating thing, though, that biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. Now that we know that Adam and Eve never were real people, the central myth of Christianity is destroyed. If there never was an Adam and Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was an original sin, there is no need of salvation. If there is no need of salvation, there is no need of a Savior. And I submit that puts Jesus, historical or otherwise, into the ranks of the unemployed." Now here's an atheist that gets the connection. He understands that if evolution really happened the way Darwin envisioned it, then you don't really need a God. And you don't have a literal Adam, so you don't have an original sin, no need of a Savior. He sees how that breaks down. And that's had an effect on people in the way they think, in the church and elsewhere. But there are a number of well-meaning theologians who have tried to suggest that maybe God used a system of evolution in some way. And we'll examine that a little bit more so in the next session. What that does, that brings forward another big question that people have, though. You probably heard somebody say, well, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? You know, why does a good God allow for all of that? Now, for the atheistic evolutionists like a Richard Dawkins, they would say, well, there's pain and suffering in the world because that's just the way it is. Tough. There's death and suffering going on. They don't really have a good explanation for that. Now, on the other hand, the Bible tells us that God did not create the world this way. He created the world in 6 days, and he called it very good. There was no death, there was no sin, there was no disease, no decay. Right? He created it very good. No pain and suffering at that point in time. But then Adam sinned, and because of that, death and decay and disease all came into the world, and that's the fallen world that we live in now. But when we understand the bigger picture, we also know that God's not going to leave it this way. He leaves it this way for a time, but ultimately he's promised us new heavens and a new earth, a restoration of the very good world for those who put their faith in Jesus. On the other hand, if we try to take a position and say that, well, maybe God used evolution in order to create a well-meaning idea, but unfortunately when somebody says that, what you're really saying is that God used millions of years of pain and suffering in order to create. And that causes people to begin to question the goodness of God. And it has led people away from their faith, including Charles Darwin. I don't know if anybody here has ever heard of a guy named Charles Templeton. He was an evangelist back in the 50s. He was friends with Billy Graham, who's even more famous than Billy at one time in Canada. There he is preaching at a crusade in Fredericton. Now, what happened was, he preached the gospel for a number of years, but then he went off to seminary at Princeton University. And they taught him evolution, which he came to believe in. And he wrote a book before he died called Farewell to God, My Reasons for Rejecting the Christian Faith. Sad story of this fellow. One of the things he said is, I believe that there is no supreme being with human attributes, no God in the biblical sense, but that life is the result of timeless evolutionary forces having reached its present transient state over millions of years. He got led away from whatever faith he had because he accepted this concept of naturalistic evolution, and he couldn't reconcile a good God with that kind of a system. The late Dr. William Provine took it a little step further. He said, let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. And I must say that these are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposeful forces of any kind, no life after death. When I die, I am absolutely certain that I am going to be completely dead. That's just all. That's going to be the end of me. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either. I often wondered why he ever got out of bed in the morning. That's the way he thought, because he believed in evolution. And now he actually was raised in the church originally. Then he took on this idea of evolution and taught it for many years. As far as we know, he died an atheist. So this is a concept that does have an effect on the way people think. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's another definition for evolution that's out there. Another way to put it is to say that evolution is a process that results in heritable changes in a population spread over many generations. In other words, change over time. Now, we observe change over time in populations of creatures. But this does not mean the same thing that everything came from a common ancestor. Right? Because it's not just a question about what kind is there change. We certainly observe change in living creatures, but is it the sort of change necessary to start from something small and simple and get more and more complex by random chance? And sometimes you'll hear these two definitions get mixed up. See, Darwin observed this sort of change. When he went on his trip around the world, he saw things like different finches on the Galapagos Islands, and they all had different sizes and shapes of beaks. And he realized they're all related to finches on the mainland, but they've adapted to their environment because of the scarcity of food. That's one of the changes that happens. Certain populations end up with the ones that have features that are well adapted to the environment. They give them a survival advantage. They survive, they reproduce, while others will die out. We could call it differential reproduction. Or he called this natural selection. You also hear of artificial selection. Anybody who breeds livestock or dogs or anything like that, you know that you can artificially select certain traits by breeding certain traits. You want faster dogs? Breed faster dogs. Right? You want longer fur? Breed longer fur. And so Darwin observed this kind of change happening artificially and naturally. But he wasn't the first person to ever talk about natural selection. A guy named Edward Blythe wrote about it 20 years before Darwin's book came out. He was a creationist, and he just saw it as a process of culling. But the ones who had traits that were not particularly good for survival in an environment, they would die out, while other traits would flourish in the population because of the survival advantage. But Darwin took it a step further. He thought, well, if you see that there's a little bit of change happening here, then given enough time, all kinds of change could happen from a single-cell common ancestor to everything else. Because at this point, Darwin already believed that the Earth was many millions of years old. So he observed natural selection in action and adaptation, and then he extrapolated that over deep time. Now, extrapolation is a useful technique in science and other things, but it can go too far. I have a couple of grandchildren, and when my grandson was first born, he was a long baby, shall we say, or a tall baby. He measured almost 24 inches at that point. Now, when he was 2 years old, he measured 34 inches in height, which is to say he had grown 10 inches in 2 years, or an average of 5 inches per year. So if we observe that amount of change and we extrapolate that, then by the time our grandson is 10 years old, he'll be 6'2". And by the time he's 18, he'll be 9'6". I'm a little bit older than that. What happened to me? See, we can look at that, we can laugh because we know there's limitations to how much a living organism can grow. But this is the kind of thing that happens when you extrapolate an observation far beyond what can actually be observed. And that's what Darwin did. One of the things he didn't know about was this thing called DNA. This tiny molecule that's in all living things that contains the coded information needed in order to create that living thing, whatever it is. So if we go back to Darwin's idea of a single-celled common ancestor, it's got to have a certain amount of information in its DNA to create that single cell. And so we could liken that to a short stack of books, if you will, a certain amount of information needed. Now the smallest single cell creature we know of that can reproduce has about almost 600,000 chemical letters or nucleotides in its DNA. That's the information. Now human beings have 3 billion base pairs of those same chemical letters. Much more complex, a lot more information needed. So if we want that single cell common ancestor to evolve into things that are more complex like a human being, we have to add a whole lot of genetic information that isn't already there to code for things like skin and hair and organs, things that that single cell doesn't have. So evolution needs the addition of a whole lot of genetic information. Can natural selection accomplish that? We do observe change over time. Let's break down how natural selection essentially works. We get all of our traits in our DNA from both mom and dad. And you don't get the same versions of a gene from both mom and dad. And so you get variation. You look at your own children, you'll find no two of them are exactly alike unless they're identical twins. So there's all kinds of variation. And so every trait, you get 2 versions of it, one from mom and one from dad. Let's take a look at the gene coding for length of fur in a population of dogs. Here's a couple of dogs that have, each one of them has a variation of the gene that codes for long fur and a variation that codes for short fur, so they have medium length fur. Now, when they have offspring, each one of them is going to pass on one of those versions of the gene, but not both, and not necessarily the same one each time. So, in one generation, you're going to have some dogs that get the long-haired gene and the short-haired gene, one from each parent, not necessarily the same ones, and they have medium-length fur. You're going to get some that get the short-haired gene from both mom and dad, and they're going to have short fur. And then, of course, some will get the long-haired gene from both parents, and they'll have long fur. Make sense so far? All right, so we see that tremendous variation. Now, let's suppose we take that population of dogs and let's send them to the Arctic, someplace really cold where the wind blows and gets really, really cold overnight. Of those dogs, which ones do you think are most likely to survive? The ones with the long fur, right? I think over time in that environment, the ones with medium and short fur are more likely to die out over time, and so you're left with the long-haired dogs. Now, what happens when those long-haired dogs have offspring? What length of fur are they going to have? They're going to all end up with long fur. They can't pass on the short-haired gene to any of their offspring because it's already been lost from the population. Now, an evolutionist might say, look, that's evolution in action. Look, they've changed. They've adapted to their environment. They survived. But did they gain any new information? No, they lost information. Right? They got long fur. That's great in the Arctic. But let's say we take those same dogs now, send them to the Mojave Desert, someplace that's really hot. They're going to be crying for that short-haired gene. And they can't get it back. They have offspring, they still can't get the short hair because it's lost from the DNA. And now they're no longer able to survive in a different environment. So natural selection gives us change over time, but it's change in a downward direction. It's a loss of genetic information, whereas evolution requires a massive increase in genetic information over time to get code for new traits that weren't already there. Now, one way that evolutionists and creationists can agree on is that there is this kind of change happening over time. You start with a parent population of some wolf or dog-like creature. We would call that a created kind, right? Probably a canine kind or something like that. Where we disagree is the amount of time it took for all those different species of dog to come into being. We would say just a few thousand years, whereas they might say millions. But we do see this variation. This is a dog, and this is a dog. This is a dog, and they tell us this is a dog. See, that right there tells me evolution doesn't make sense, because that is not an improvement on anything. The only way that guy survives is if somebody carries him around in their purse and feeds him treats. No offense to anybody that has one. But we see that variation. And when we consider the larger created kind, not just different species of dog, but dingoes and foxes and wolves all appear to be related in a larger created kind, and we see all this variation in our world. But what we don't see within there is a dog turning into a cat or a bird or something like that. Zoologist Walter Fite explained it this way. He said the very name selection implies that you're choosing between two or more variants. So that means that the end result is extinction of one in favor of the other, like those dogs we saw. Natural selection never increases the number of variants, it only decreases them. So how does a mechanism that makes less and less end up making more and more? Yeah, that's what we're supposed to believe. One last analogy for this. Suppose I start with a unicycle. It's got a certain number of parts in it. Let's suppose I want to take that and make a bicycle. Well, I could select certain parts from the unicycle to make the bicycle, right? But then I need a second wheel. I need handlebars, I need pedals. I can't select enough from the unicycle to make the bicycle. Or if I go a step further to a motorcycle, a moped, some similar parts there, but again, I can't select enough from the bicycle to make the motorcycle. And so natural selection is change, but it's in the wrong direction for evolution to occur. And I just lost the signal. Here we go. All right, this is where I get Walter to help me out here. All right, so We talk about this evolutionary tree of life. Oh, there it is, right? That was Darwin's concept. Now, sometimes we creationists who believe what the Bible says are considered to be, we preach fixity of species. The idea that all the species in the world as they are now have always been like that, nothing's ever changed. That's not really what the Bible says. Because the species of now, they're not the same as the created kinds that were there from the beginning. So really, it's more like this. You get all different created kinds, larger categories, like the dog kind or the canine kind, feline kind, and so on. And then there's variation that happens within that, but not from one to the other. That's what we observe. And we see that kind of thing all over our world, things reproducing according to their kinds. Now, somebody could be thinking, well, what about mutations? You know, we hear about these things called mutations, and if we all get enough mutations, we can all be superheroes. Right? Read that in comic books. Now, it doesn't really work that way. Mutations do happen, but they generally mess things up. They don't generally make things better and better. What are mutations? Well, they're copying errors that happen in our DNA. Right? Our DNA is made up of a sequence of 4 different chemical letters in different sequences, in different combinations, and that's where the information is that codes for whatever the creature is going to be. But as cells divide and the DNA gets copied, copying errors happen over time. And so you might get 2 letters that are put in backwards, or a letter inserted where it wasn't supposed to be, things like that, copying mistakes that happen. There's mechanisms to prevent some of those mutations, but some of them do get through over time. Now let's suppose I were to hand you a piece of paper that said, once upon a time there was a little girl named Goldilocks. Fairly simple text, we can understand it. Suppose I hand that to you on a piece of paper, and I say, I want you to copy that on another piece of paper and hand that to the next person. And then you copy that onto another piece of paper and hand that on. And we send it around the room, always passing on the copy of the previous copy, never an original. What do you suppose is going to happen? Anybody ever played the telephone game? It's going to change over time, right? Copying errors are going to happen eventually. And you maybe it'll start to say, once upon Tim, there was a Whittle Grill named Goldilocks. We can still kind of understand it, but you can see what happened just from copying errors. If we send that same paper around hundreds, thousands, millions of people, though, we're going to get the works of Shakespeare. No. Not going to work that way, is it? That's what evolutionists want us to believe, though. The mutations happen, and natural selection now operates on those mutations, and we get things that are bigger and more complex and better. But that's not how mutations work. They mess things up. Now, never mind the works of Shakespeare. Dawkins said this in one of his books. He said, there is enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. Now, for you young people, an encyclopedia, a big set of books. It was before Google, okay? A lot of information in one place, that's the idea. But you know, even if you took that much information and ran it through a computer program that was designed to make a copying error mistake every once in a while, eventually you're going to get something you can't read. Right? Because the mutations degrade things, they don't make them better. Now somebody could say, well, what about beneficial mutations? We hear about those, and they do happen from time to time, but they're rather few and far between. For example, Darwin observed on the island of Madeira near Portugal that there were some wingless beetles. Right? Normally beetles have wings, but this is a windy island, so what was happening is that these winged beetles, they fly up in the air, they get swept out in the ocean, they die. A mutation occurred somewhere along the way that some of these beetles were born without wings. They didn't fly in the air, so they didn't get swept in the ocean, they survived. And they became a dominant population on the island. Now the evolutionists will say, look at that, that's evolution. It's changed. They adapted, they survived. But did they gain any new information? No, they lost information. Normally not having wings is not a good deal for a beetle. It just happened to be a benefit in that particular environment, but they lost the ability to grow wings after that. Or maybe you've heard about antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Let's take a look at Helicobacter pylori. It's the bacteria that causes stomach ulcers. Now this can be treated with an antibiotic because this bacteria has an enzyme in it, and when that enzyme is in the presence of the antibiotic will stick to it, turn to a poison, and kill the bacteria. But sometimes a mutation occurs in which the bacteria is born doesn't have that enzyme. So then when the antibiotic is present, it's got nothing to stick to, and it doesn't turn to a poison, and the bacteria survives. So the evolutionist says, look, evolution, right? It's changed, it survived. But did it gain any new information? No, it lost information. And normally not having that enzyme is not a good deal. Just happened to be a benefit in that particular instance. And so we see this kind of, so even with mutations, we see change that is occasionally beneficial in certain circumstances, but it's still a downward change. It's a loss of information, and these are few and far between. But mutations do continue to happen. You're accumulating mutations in your DNA constantly throughout your lifetime. Now, most of them are not particularly life-threatening, and so natural selection doesn't take them out. Most of them just accumulate because they're neutral or slightly destructive. Now, the only way, now some people would say, well, doesn't natural selection take out the bad mutations? It can if they're bad enough, but it doesn't operate at the molecular level and take out these little letters. The only way natural selection can happen is if you take out the whole organism. So you lose people or dogs or whatever from the population. Meanwhile, you got a bunch of others that still have mutations that are accumulating generation after generation. And it's a little bit like rust on a car. You know, you get a little bit of rust on your car, it doesn't look too bad, it kind of still runs. But if it accumulates long enough, you get something that, you know, it's just going to go to the junkyard. It's just going to disintegrate. And that's the way mutations operate. They accumulate to the point where we just get worse and worse. And the general overall fitness of the population tends to go down over time. There's a geneticist by the name of Dr. John Sanford who wrote a book called Genetic Entropy, where he studied this. It's a concept called genetic load. What we know is that every generation inherits, on average, 100 more mutations than the generation before. So that means that your parents, you have probably 100 more mutations than your parents had from birth. That means your children will have all of those plus 100 more. Their children will have all those plus 100 more, and so on. And that's been observed since the 50s. Evolutionists look at this and say, we should be extinct by now. Because they think we've been around for a couple 100,000 years. Of course, in a shorter time frame, it's not that big of a deal. But we do know that these mutations are accumulating generation after generation. Now, what Sanford did is he created a program called Mendel's Accountant, which basically predicts the overall population fitness if you have these mutations over time. You plot in the size of the population, the number of offspring, the number of mutations, and over 200 generations, that sloping red line represents the general overall fitness of a human population. We're going downhill. Evolutionists think we're going uphill and getting better and better, but genetics tells us no, we're deteriorating, we're decaying. We're subjected to futility because we're in a fallen world. The Bible tells us that. And things are just going to go downhill until God recreates new heavens and new earth. Of course, that means eventually extinction will occur. You know, perhaps the Lord will return before that time. Now, Sanford did another similar graph, and he used different data. Got some from the Bible. You probably noticed in Genesis that the patriarchs lived for many hundreds of years, and then the flood happened, and you'll notice that the lifespans start to go down rather sharply. Noah lived to be 950 years old, Shem lived to be 600, and then generation after generation the lifespans go down. Moses lived to be 120, and what he did is he graphed these lifespans from the Bible and from other sources over several generations, and he got a very similar sloping red line. Now, this is not definitive proof of anything, you understand, but it's kind of interesting that there's a correlation there, as if there's something genetic going on ever since Noah's flood, when we had that genetic bottleneck of only 8 people that got off the ark. Maybe something got lost there. I want to finish off by talking about information, because DNA is all about information. Now, here's an information system we might recognize. How many of you remember this fella? How many of you are old enough to remember that song he used to sing? Come on, sing it with me. I don't know if he sings it anymore, but it's a ridiculous song because that's not a word, right? Right? That's our alphabet. Now, it's got all the information in it needed to make words and sentences in the English language and many others, but by itself, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just a sequence of letters. Who can tell me what this says? Okay, how about this one? Who can tell me what that says right there?
Orange.
Orange, right, you recognize that. You recognize the color. Got some orange paint. You recognize the letters and how to sound them out. You recognize, we can interpret that. We understand that word in English means a piece of fruit or a color. But we have to be able to understand those letters. So let's go back to this one. What does that mean? Well, if you understand Japanese syllabary, each one of those symbols represents a syllable in Japanese. And if you know what they are, you can pronounce this orange. Orange. But in order to know that, you have to know what each symbol means, how to pronounce it, and what those symbols in a string mean. The information isn't actually in the characters themselves, or in the paint, or in the ink on the paper. We have to interpret the information from those symbols, the meaning that's been attached to that. There isn't any meaning in the paint itself, it's the information. It's an intangible thing. Now, we can apply this concept to DNA. Karl Popper said something interesting. He said, what makes the origin of life and the genetic code a disturbing riddle is this. The genetic code is without any biological function unless it is translated. But the machinery by which the cell translates the code consists of at least 50 macromolecular components which are themselves coded in the DNA. Thus, the code cannot be translated except by using certain products of its translation. Let me translate that. You got all the coded information in your DNA and those letters and everything to create whoever you're going to be, all your traits. But in order for that to be any good, it's got to be translated by these little molecular machines that do the translating. However, in order to build that little machine, you have to translate the information in the DNA code. So you need the machine to translate the code to get the information to build the machine that you see the problem there? It's a real big issue for anybody who suggests that the first cell came into being by accident, that DNA came into existence by natural processes, because you got all these things that have to be there all at once. Amazing design. Information expert Werner Getz said, a code system is always the result of a mental process. It requires an intelligent origin or inventor. It should be emphasized that matter as such is unable to generate any code. There is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. But that's what the evolutionists, the naturalists, want us to believe. Oddly enough, Paul Davies, an astrobiologist, said something similar. He said, how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. He said, there's no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Now understand, Paul Davies doesn't believe in an intelligent designer or creator. He believes that everything did happen randomly over periods of time. But he's admitting nobody knows how that could possibly happen. Nobody knows how that single-celled ancestor could come about. Back to Getz. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required. You need a thinking being to write the word orange, to write Goldilocks, the works of Shakespeare. Imagine the intelligence needed to write the amount of massive information in DNA. I want to show you a brief video that gives you an idea of a little bit of what goes on inside our cells on a constant basis. You may want to check the volume, make sure it's not too loud. Might want to turn it on.
It's how the digital information encoded within DNA is used to direct protein synthesis. This is a DNA double helix containing the digital code which directs the cell in all aspects of operation. And here we see a protein complex called an RNA polymerase traveling down the DNA strand. As it moves down the strand, it carefully unwinds the DNA, preparing it for transcription. Inside the polymerase, we see a single-stranded copy of the original instructions being assembled as individual bases are positioned and added to the growing strand. A stop code marks the end of the protein specification, at which point this copy, known as a messenger RNA transcript, exits the polymerase and heads towards a two-part chemical manufacturing machine called the ribosome. While the messenger RNA moves towards the ribosome, transfer RNA molecules attach to specific amino acids in preparation for assembly. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation begins. Using the instructions encoded on the messenger RNA as a template, the transfer RNA molecules align specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids, creating a protein chain. As this chain exits the ribosome, it is met by chaperones which prevent premature folding, while escorting the protein to a barrel-shaped machine called a chaperonin. This machine helps fold the protein into the precise shape required to perform its function. Although it is unclear how the chaperonin achieves this, we do know that accurate folding is essential in order for the protein to accomplish its intended function. Once the protein is complete, it is released into the cytoplasm to do its job.
Isn't evolution amazing? No, I think when we see something like that, we can agree with the psalmist here, who said, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." Yes, all the way down to the tiniest molecule. Amazing, amazing design. Or Romans 1:20, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." The Apostle Paul, almost 2,000 years ago, told us that ever since creation, we've been able to look around at the amazing design and everything in creation and see God. How much more so today? With everything we know about the cosmos, everything we know about the human body, about cells, DNA, and everything else, how much more are we without excuse for seeing that there is an amazing God who designed all of this? And yet, many refuse to believe that. Try to find other explanations. Now, I've thrown a lot of information at you very, very quickly, and everybody remembers every bit of it, right? No. It's why we're an information ministry. It's why we have the resources so you can do more study on your own. And Evolution's Achilles Heels is a good book for that. 9 PhD scientists looking at a number of things like DNA, like fossils, like natural selection, and showing how they support creation better than evolution. Good DVD to talk about the difference between natural selection and evolution is Creatures Do Change, but it's not evolution. And I mentioned John Sanford, his book Genetic Entropy. You can get that book if you want to dig in more to the genetics and how that all works. Or a good DVD from Dr. Robert Carter is The High-Tech Cell, showing just how complex our DNA really is. It codes in 4 different dimensions simultaneously. It's kind of like having a line of text that codes in 4 different languages all at the same time. And Jonathan Sarfaty's By Design looks at a number of living creatures and shows how intelligently and beautifully designed they are by God. And I'll mention this book in the next session, the Creation Answers book. answers over 60 of the most asked questions that people have about Genesis and creation. And we do have a magazine called Creation Magazine. I'll talk more about that in the next session. But it comes out every 3 months, and if you want to get hold of that information, you can come to the table. And if you don't want to spend any money today, that's fine. We do have a website. Our website's called creation.com, and you can use that search engine. Lots of great information there. So I'm going to ask Pastor Sean if you would close this session and come and see me in the next one.
Thank you, Thomas. So we're going to give him a short breather. The resource table is out in the foyer. We are going to start the service at 10:45 sharp. So if you can make your way into the sanctuary for that. There's lots of donuts left, so grab a donut during the break, check out the table, and that creation.com website is amazing. There is so much good stuff on there. I go there quite often. So we'll close her up now, give you a little rest, and we'll see you all back in the sanctuary at 10:45.